So, I know a lot of your faces, I know a lot of your names, the vast majority of you. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Tim Freitag. I'm the guy you got the letter from a week or so ago. And I serve as the administrator for the community. With us tonight is Bill Pino, our city engineer. Cindy Keller is our park and recreation director. We have one older person, Peggy Byer, in the house, standing in the back. And I see at least one plan commissioner, Ron Farrell, is with us tonight. So thanks a lot for coming. We were setting chairs up this afternoon and we really didn't know how many chairs to put out. It got pretty cold and it's pretty windy, so you guys are a hardy lot. So thanks for coming out. I would think before we, I look at this project as a bit like a marathon. We're kind of at the starting point, and I would think there'll be a couple more opportunities to get together to talk about this project over the course of the next 7, 8, 9 months. Come on in, boys.
Hi, Mayor. Vinny.
So the two arrivees, Dale Opperman is our mayor, and
Hello.
Vinnie Krause is our second alder person that's here tonight. So anyway, most of you know that the city has obtained an option to purchase what we know as the former Meadow Springs 5 holes golf course. And we're going to tell you a little bit about that tonight. What I really hope to do is to separate some of the fact from fiction. You'd be surprised since this first hit the papers how many things people have asked me about. I've been told that, or asked that the city is buying the 13-hole golf course. I've been asked if the city has already purchased this property. And I think I've been asked things like if the city does buy the property, they've heard that we're going to sell the clubhouse to someone who wants to own a funeral home. I'm here to separate that. None of that has happened. So, all right, we'll get to that. But this is potentially a pretty complicated arrangement. For those of you that live either on the 5 holes or adjacent, you know there's issues with groundwater, elevations, soils, potential wetlands, that the city is going to have to take a look at all of those things. At the end of the day, I would surmise, reading the tea leaves, if the city council decides to exercise the option and buy the property, certainly 2 things would have to happen. One, there'd have to be a fair amount of neighborhood support, but I think there also has to be a fair amount of community support because this does involve an expenditure of public dollars. So I would think over the next certainly 7, 8, 9 months, there'll be plenty of opportunities for public meetings. But tonight what I hope to do is to give you a little bit of history as to how we got to this point. I want to talk a little bit about the option agreement. The third thing I'd like us to do is talk a little bit about one preliminary site development concept. Some of you are holding it in your hands. That's just a concept. Nothing's in concrete at this point in time, but it's one of the things that we thought early on might work out there. Then the fourth thing I wanted to talk a little bit about, if you folks want to come up and grab a chair, you got some seats. Hi, glad you could join us. The fourth thing I wanted to talk a little bit about happens to be some of the things that the city is going to have to take a look at during the option period. And this stuff will all be reported back to the council. We'll talk about it at future meetings. But things we're going to need to investigate before the city certainly would agree to buy the property. We'll talk about that. We'll talk very briefly about next steps. And then lastly, we'll open it up to any questions you might have. I would say if you don't want to ask a question from the audience, we're going to hang around for 15, 20, 25 minutes. You can come up and ask them individually if you're more comfortable with that. So, having said all of that, I'll start with the history of this. I think it was the very first part of summer, we were approached by a number of neighbors at the golf course with complaints generally about the maintenance of the property, but in particular the number of dead or dying trees that exist on the property. So there was, I think, Earlene, you were one of them. We had a couple of meetings with the Streets Committee. At the end of the day, the city went on the property, surveyed the dead trees. I think we have about 55 plus or minus dead, primarily ash trees or trees that, if they're not dead, they're in some stage of dying back and will be dead very, very shortly. Ultimately, the city issued an order to the current property owner. You would probably know them as Madison Golf. Basically, in order to remove the trees with a date certain for that removal. And it was during the course of discussions with the Madison Golf people where we started to ask questions about the ongoing maintenance, what were their plans for the property, and I would say somewhat shocking to not only myself but all of us, they don't have any plans for the property. They don't have plans to develop it. They don't have plans to sell it. So I think, the thing that struck me is, well, this thing is going to be somewhat poorly maintained going forward. And while I really can't say this, I can't help but thinking at some point they're going to get sick of writing checks. They got to pay the property taxes. They've got to hire someone to cut the grass. And what happened if the property owner were just to walk away? So, and then there's a foreclosure, and my own sense then, if that were to happen, if we think we have problems with the maintenance of the property now, that gets much, much worse. So we started to talk to Madison Golf about willingness to sell the property under the right or the very, I would say, very, very special conditions that we'll describe to you in just a few minutes. One thing led to another. We went back, talked to the Common Council. The Common Council said, well, see if we can make a deal and bring it back, and if it's reasonable, we'll consider optioning the property. Ultimately, that is what really has happened here. So that's how we got from the early part of summer to just shortly before Thanksgiving. The option was approved by both parties. It's been recorded across the street with the Register of Deeds. And the option period is for 9 months. So it's a little longer option. Generally, I will tell you, this is positioned for a below market value sale. The purchase price, should the city decide to exercise the option, is $225,000 for basically what you see in red right there. It's about 35 plus or minus acres plus the improvements, which we know would include the clubhouse, that little building that sits just adjacent to the clubhouse, and then the maintenance shed that sits down on the southeastern portion of the property. So that would be the negotiated selling price should the city exercise the option. I will tell you, we have not had the property appraised. It currently is on the property tax rolls for $420,000. What I just described, the 35 acres plus the improvements. So you're probably asking, well, how did you get Madison Golf to agree to a below market value sale? And I want to just describe this very broadly. I think it will make a little sense when Bill and Cindy talk about the site development plan for the property. But essentially, what has happened is that we agreed that if the city purchased it, we would assign the value that we would pay for it against the small portion of the property. They would essentially give the city the bulk or the majority of the property, and then they would take the charitable write-off on their taxes. So they need to structure it, but basically that's our deal. So if we do close on the property, we're going to need to sort of figure all that out going forward. But that's really how we got to the position of being able to buy it. you know, relatively cheap. If you do the math, you know it's not a great sum per acre of property to be purchased. So the other thing I would mention is that we had to pay them something for the right to tie up the property to option it for a 9-month period. In return for that option, the city has agreed to take down the 55 plus or minus dead trees. Cindy will talk about that when that work is going to begin. But that's basically, is it not, Chris Rogers, City Attorney, the nuts and bolts of the deal. Probably sounds more complicated than it really is. So that brings us to the next topic on tonight's agenda. And I wish that we could tell you more, but this is a complicated deal. We're going to need a large portion of that option period to investigate, to look at a number of things, which ultimately we will report back to you. We'll describe that tonight. But there's a lot of things that we just aren't going to be able to answer because we just don't know, and probably really won't start that work until after the first of the year. So the site development plan that we put together for this property to start a conversation, that's really what we're doing. There is nothing that is cast in concrete. It's a concept. I think we put together over a couple of months of discussion, quite frankly. Bill, I'm going to turn this over to you first, and then Cindy, you can, for these folks, describe really what that concept is, and
Sure.
no doubt we'll have some questions about it.
So we're going to first talk about what this concept is, and then after that, we'll actually discuss the next steps over what we're going to do over the next 9 months to see if this option is viable or if any option is viable for us at this point. So I'm going to first talk about what we think may be the developable portion of this. And when I'm saying developable, I'm talking about residential lots. And specifically, more, you guys have this, or some of you guys have this as well, but I'm talking about this area right here. So the overall property is about 35 acres. This area right here is about 10 acres. Why did we look at that area first? Mainly because of the fact that it's adjacent to South Dewey Avenue. We did look at other options as far as we had questions about, well, what about putting a street through Stop and Bach Park? Typically the cost and why some of these developments don't occur is because of the fact that the infrastructure cost is so high that it just doesn't make developing a property viable. So here, because we've already got utilities in portions of Dewey, it makes sense to be able to develop one side of this. And obviously we've already got lots on this side here. The golf course is down here. Water's already extended through here. As far as sanitary, we've got sanitary down to Spring, and then as far as north as Pondview Court. So this gap will have to be completed for sanitary to be able to develop lots through here. And then in addition, whether or not this road is ever, again, this is a concept, could be extended through, this is certainly higher elevation, could be nice lots through there. We would have to extend water, sanitary, and storm sewer off of Dewey to be able to do that as well. I guess other things to look at how we would do this is, some people ask, is the city going to be the developer on this, or are you going to just sell off the land? We're going to look at all those things, but ideally, the city may be looking at trying to work with some developers over the course of 9 months to be able to take a look at whether or not this land is desirable to be able to sell. I think anybody that lives in the city is probably not going to argue that we do not have a lot of available land for building lots on. The area over here by Clancy certainly has developed over the last several years, but that's really one of the only areas that we have in the city. So that was actually one of the reasons that we looked at this as well. As far as how many and the size of the lots, that's really going to be determined as we're looking at this to be able to see, one, what's desirable, what's saleable. Certainly, this is not something that we want to be able to hold on to for a long period of time. So those are going to be those conversations that we're going to have with a couple different developers and real estate agents to be able to talk about this. In a few minutes, I will actually talk about what steps we're going to look at, not only for that area, but also for the rest of the lots to be able to determine whether or not this portion is developable, and as well as the conservancy. Cindy's going to chat here a few minutes on the conservancy.
Just one quick point, remember that below market value sale, so the idea would be if that property is developable, the value of 225 would be assigned against this property, and then the rest of the property basically given to the city, and that's the way we get to that below market value sale. The one thing I would say before Cindy starts that I meant to say at the very beginning is that we started to look at other reuse concepts or repurposing this property because we do not believe the chances are great that there will never be golf played out there again. To go in and restore those fairways, rebuild the greens, rebuild the irrigation system, that's a pretty significant expenditure of money. I think never, doesn't mean never, but the likelihood of that happening probably isn't real great. So we started to think about other uses or repurposing that property.
Sir,
Yes?
I wonder if you could just clear something up for me about what you just mentioned. In the newspaper article, it said that the golf course had no interest in using this again, and I just heard you mention the cost of reconditioning it. But I was led to believe by some of the members on the golf board at the golf course that they had approached the city with a proposal where they had some grant money to help recondition, and then they would enter into a partnership with you for a couple of years, and then eventually it would go over them, but the city would somehow reap some money out of that deal. I don't know how true or false any of that is, but it's obviously different than what was in the paper. Could you comment on that at all?
Oh, yeah. Well, I'd be glad to say there has been some discussions with the current Gulf Board, not by myself, but other city representatives. And I think, essentially the message was, that isn't something they would be able to undertake at this point. In terms of this proposal, I don't know, I've never seen any proposal with. I can tell you the original 13 holes is in a foundation largely because I don't know the amount, but there is a foundation of the PGA that put money into ultimately that 13 holes. That's why that part is in a charitable foundation with a board of directors. But I've never heard anything about something similar for this 5 holes of this property.
So the part I get to talk about is the best part. So what we were looking at here is trying to develop, what could we do with this property and make it usable for the community, and what would be a good thing. So what the original concept is that we would take about 80% of this property and turn it into native prairie, wetland, and woodland areas. With that, you will see that there's like a mowed buffer that goes around the entire property on both sides. That's about a 20-foot mowed buffer, which would, what that will do is 2 things for us. One, it will allow the general public to realize that that is not their property. And also it will provide a fire break for us, which I'll talk about when I start talking about the maintenance of the area. And with this mowed area, what we would also do is look at some areas where we may need to put like a permanent boundary marker so that people are not coming into your backyards. Well, the other thing is that this trail, if we put in, this will be an asphalt path, which will be about a mile loop. We will have a trailhead at the old clubhouse with off-street parking, and we'll have entrances at Green, Rock, and then we'll put 2 at Dewey and possibly at this cul-de-sac is where we would have one. What we're going to try to do with this path, we will try to avoid as many of the mature trees as we can. So it's going to be a meandering asphalt trail. And what we're finding is that, I know a concern that some people have talked to me about is that they don't want people walking in their backyard. Well, if people have a choice between walking on asphalt and walking on grass, and as you know, a lot of that grass is wetland, they're going to pick the asphalt path, especially if that's how we funnel them in there. So a couple other things that we would be then doing is looking at signage, birdhouses, benches, things like that to make it more of just a nice natural area. Throughout the maintenance of it, approximately 2 acres of it will be mowed on a regular basis. That will be the mowed buffer area. The rest of it will be prairie plantings that we will be burning off every year, but we will burn about 1/3 of it each year. So what'll happen is that we'll take 1/3 of it, so every 3 years the whole thing will be burned, and that will be what we'll do to keep the invasive species out and to also help keep the prairie plants growing. One thing I want to tell you though is when we say we're going to plant a prairie, it doesn't mean the first year the prairie will be beautiful. It's going to take a 3 to 5 year timeline to get those prairie plants established. So I just want you to understand that. Our other plan is to take some of these areas that'll be more visible and put some showier perennial plants in there. So it isn't going to be what you see now there with a lot of buckthorn and weeds and things like that. Our plan is really to do native prairie grasses and plants in there. So I'll let you finish up.
All right, the last thing I wanted to talk about, I'll take that later, are the existing buildings.
Excuse me, I have a question.
Yeah.
Regarding the 20 feet that you're going to cut to maintain, is that also going, are you also going to, I don't want to say fertilize, but put weed killer and stuff in there to prevent weeds from migrating into the property of the people?
There will have to be
back there?
some herbicide treatments.
Okay,
But-
no, that's good.
Yeah, but I don't exactly know what we'll be doing yet in that area.
Okay, thank you.
Yep.
So the last thing I'm going to talk about before we talk about what's going to happen over the next 8 months is the two structures that we've got on the property. The first is the maintenance shed, which is down in this area. Now certainly if that cul-de-sac is extended through that, facility would end up being raised and removed. Now at one time, that facility housed all of the irrigation equipment for not only this 5 holes, but also the 13 holes across the street. What it's our understanding is that all of the irrigation across for the existing 13 holes has been disconnected. So this facility is currently not being used for anything. So we'll certainly have to verify that to make sure that in the case that it is raised, we don't all of a sudden shut off the irrigation for the 13 holes. But it's our understanding that that is currently not connected to the existing golf course. The other one is the clubhouse. Anybody that's driven by that knows it's in pretty rough shape. Needs a new roof. Administrator Freitag, myself, I can't remember if the mayor went through, mayor did, and also the building inspector. We went through the facility to just get an idea of what condition it was in. What I can tell you is that in the last couple of years, we did have a break in the water pipes in that, and ended up flooding out a portion of the building. There's a lot of mold, there's a lot of damage in there. There's a lot of damage from there's been break-ins out there, vandalism, things like that. So to say that that building is salvageable, we'll evaluate that. But what I can tell you is that we are going to keep our options open with that as far as whether or not the building could be reused. But at this point, like Tim had indicated, we don't know a lot about that building. But certainly raising that building is an option for us that will be considered. Whether or not there's other viable options down the line, we'll look at that in the next 8 months.
Question.
Yeah.
What would you reuse it for? I mean, what would potentially go on that corner?
That's a good question. And those are the things we're going to be looking at. One, if there's a desire to be able to keep the building, what could it be kept for? One of the challenges with that property is it's on a separate parcel and it's zoned R1. Because it's zoned R1, you're not going to put a commercial use in it. The only thing that could really be put in there as a conditional use is a church, which is what was previously in there. So more than likely, the use that would need to be would be some type of residential use, whether or not that's reuse of the existing structure or it's raised and look at some type of residential use. But at this point, we don't know. And we just need to be able to go through that. We're certainly going to have to look at abatement because I'm sure there is asbestos in that as portions of the building. So if it is raised or even reused, those things would have to be looked at.
Could it be rezoned?
It would be an uphill battle because of the fact that everything around that is R1 also. So one of the things that the Planning Commission has to look at is to not spot zone a property. And what that means is you don't put a commercial or a separate zoning when it's surrounded by common zoning. So could it be? Potentially, but...
So could it be rezoned to be incorporated into this wetland and the prairie? It can't be part of that?
Well, again, the land that, we're going to be looking at everything. I'll say that all options are on the table, but that is a potential that we're not quite sure how that's going to look. And again, as we're going through this process, we may have someone come through and say, I don't want to affect the existing zoning, and I want to buy that building and renovate it. Is that a possibility the city may look at? Sure. One of the things that it's just like the developable portion through there is that one of the things that the city has to look at is because of the fact that we're using tax dollars to be able to purchase this, is what money could we possibly recover from this, which is why we're looking at developable portions of that. So the clubhouse right now, our first steps, and I'll get into that in a few minutes, is going to be evaluating the condition of the existing building to see if it can be saved. And then the next step down the line is going to be, if it can't be saved, what are our options? So again, as Tim has said, we can't give you a lot of information because we're early on in the process at this point. So, but I will say there's not any options that have been taken off the table at this point. So.
Thank you, Bill. So the next thing we'll briefly discuss is we wanted you to know what we're going to be doing primarily after the first of the year. I would imagine the first 3 or 4 months of 2020 to continue the investigation of this property. We'll each take a piece of this. I'll take the portion of the property we think that is most likely to have development or redevelopment potential that's stripped along Dewey. So what we will be doing is we will be meeting with developers to get their opinion as to how attractive that area may be for development. Generally speaking, I'll speak for myself and no one else. If we're able to develop that property, I think the lots look kind of a lot like you would find on the circle. Those are about 1/3 of an acre in size lots. Single family, there would have to be some restrictive covenants, so there's homes ultimately built that are compatible with what you find on the circle or the neighborhoods adjacent to the property. I will say this, is that developable? I don't know. There's a number of things we need to look at. One would be the elevation of the property. If you were standing on Dewey looking west, you would see that the elevation of that property is below the grade of the road along a lot of the lineal length of Dewey as it runs along that portion of the old golf course. Almost surely you'd have to bring in some amount of fill to build that area up. I'm betting it would look a lot like what probably happened in the circle. If you look all the way to the circle, you can see that's been elevated. obviously they brought in fill when they developed that subdivision. That will have to be taken a look at. The other thing that has to be taken a look at, and Bill, you will talk a little bit more about, is the soils. You know, are they compactable, and can you really build something there? You know, we would need to take a look at it. Or does it become so expensive if you're bringing in compactable fill that in our market we just can't build and sell a marketable home? The third thing that we will need to take a look at, and I think this is, you know, a fairly big component of this, is it seems to me, and you would know better than I do, but it would seem to me, if you look back over 50 years, the way water moves through that site has changed, right? There are springs on the site, but we need to really understand the hydrology better to see whether you really can develop lots there. I think at this point, you know, we're just not sure. Almost surely, as Bill, I think, will tell you, as part of something like this, you know, you're making some stormwater improvements. You may be putting in some retention basins. There may be some tiling. There may be the ability to connect some of the property into the city public stormwater system that runs under streets to help it drain better. You know, we just don't know at this point. It's something that really is going to have to be taken a look at. But in regard to the developable portion, meeting with developers, talking to a consulting engineer about things like fill, condition of soils, and groundwater, those are all things that, you know, we'll be doing like the first quarter of next year, 2020.
So for this concept or any concept to happen, one of the things, and it's going to be one of the first things we try to look at, unfortunately this is not an ideal time to do it, is the potential for wetlands on the property. Anytime that over an acre of land is developed or disturbed, if this is developed, it will have to be submitted to the DNR for stormwater evaluation. And one of the first things they look at is what's called a wetland indicator. And it's a pink symbol that occurs on a DNR map, and unfortunately just about everything in Jefferson shows up as pink on these. That doesn't necessarily mean that there's wetlands, but it means that there are wetland type soils that could be present that need to be evaluated. So in this area, certainly this area up here where we've got probably 8-foot tall cattails will be wetlands. There's no doubt about that. The question is,
Sir,
what
could you
is
repeat that? It'll be what? I couldn't hear.
wetlands?
But what's going to happen? Did you say something was going to happen?
Not yet.
What I'm saying is that we're going to evaluate the entire 35 acres for wetland determination. What that involves is the first step is simply to look at the soils, the hydrology, and the vegetation to determine the likelihood that there are wetlands on the property. Once that it's determined if there is or isn't, the next step is actually a wetland delineation to define those lines. To give you an example, right in here, I'm not a wetland biologist, but based on my experience, that is going to be wetlands out there.
Could you point to that again, please?
Yeah.
Where is that?
We lost you.
That's
You lost the letters now.
There we go.
There we go.
Yeah.
Right up here by the clubhouse.
Okay.
And those
What's
are
that
those
mean?
cattails there.
What's it mean if it's wetlands designated? You can't.
That's what I was going to get into next. So if something is designated as a wetland, it means it can't be used for stormwater management. So you can't all of a sudden take an existing wetland and make a pond out of that area. What it also means is that it creates a 50-foot buffer around that that can't be developed. Now, that 50-foot buffer, you could put stormwater management in that, but essentially what that determination and eventual delineation is going to determine is the viability of not only this as developable land, but also this as a conservancy. So certainly some of these upper areas here, I wouldn't anticipate that we'd have any type of wetlands over there, and we could look at developing those. But the first step is really to determine what the extents of the wetlands may be on that property. And then that will actually dictate the design or any design moving forward for paths, development, etc. So currently, I'm awaiting a meeting with a wetland biologist to take a look at this area. Unfortunately, the time that wetland delineations are done for the year, and we'd have to look at during the growing season of next year, which is why we went with a 9-month option on this. So the second thing that we'll be looking at, and depending on how the winter treats us, this may have to wait till the spring also, is the soils. Now, I'm not necessarily concerned about the soils in these areas because we're not looking at developing those. But what we will have to look at is the soils in any areas where we may look at stormwater management. Right now what we're doing is just simply showing it here and in this back area here. And then anywhere where we would look at potentially having foundations on the site. So we will end up hiring a firm to be able to come out on the site. The things they're going to look at is the characteristics of the soil to be able to maintain foundations, depth to groundwater, other characteristics on whether or not a pond can hold water or you have to import clay to be able to hold water. All of those types of things we will get from a report to determine exactly which portions of the land are developable. And the last characteristic that we're going to have to look at is stormwater management. I talked to several of the people in this room about issues with sumps running continually. Now, I can tell you that I've been with the city for 5 years. The first year that we were here, this ditch right here that comes through the property and eventually gets out to the storm sewer here, this was completely overgrown. So I was able at that point 4 years ago to be able to drive back to that with city vehicles. We were able to cut down trees, cut down vegetation to be able to get water to flow through there again. This year there's absolutely no way that we could drive vehicles back there. And that's one of the reasons that a lot of this area here wasn't mowed, because it's wet. So one of the things that we're going to be looking at is it simply a historic high groundwater? And we are seeing that statewide. Every conference I go to, every municipality that we talk to is concerned with high groundwater. So one of the things we'll take a look at is if there's anything else that man-made features that might have been present at the golf course at one time that simply are not functioning the way they should be, that should be draining this area better. So we've obtained maps from Madison Golf on the existing golf course to be able to see what infrastructure should be there. We're overlaying that onto some drone footage that we did to be able to evaluate whether or not there's infrastructure that's on site that maybe it's just plugged that'll drain it. All of those things we'll be looking at, but certainly we know that if the city takes over this property, that we're going to be now responsible for that stormwater on site. And certainly from a stormwater standpoint, a conservancy will take a large portion of that water as well. So those are the things that I will be looking at over the course of the next 8 months to be able to determine all of these areas and see, again, if any of this stuff is developable and what challenges we may see there.
So as Tim first talked about, one of the first reasons that this came all about was because of the dead trees. So in the next 8 months, our department, along with Public Works, will be working on removing those trees. So you will see shortly activity back there. We're hoping with this cold weather, we'll be able to actually get back there and start removing. This is going to be a slow process. There's 55 trees. You will see trees that will be started to take down. There may be some standing trunks. There may be some piles of brush. We will be getting it all out of there, but it will take some time. So I just want you to be aware that you will see people back there taking trees down. Um, I personally marked every single tree. Bill and I went out and marked them, so you will see numbers on tree trunks as you've gone out there. And so some of the trees will come down very easy. Some are going to take a little bit of finesse because they are close to property lines, and we want to make sure that we get those down without harming any properties. Because the area is Meadow Springs and it is wet, we do have to wait for the ground to firm a little bit. So just bear with us on that. In regards to the Conservancy, one of the things that I'm going to be looking at is, if this is a Conservancy, how do we operate it? Will it be a city park? Will it be a Conservancy with a board? Are there neighbors that are willing to make up a foundation and a board to govern over this property? Those are the things that we need to take a look at. And that's one of the reasons to have you all here tonight, is to see, do we have people that are interested in that may have an expertise or a desire to learn more about conservancies. This type of property, I've seen it many ways. I've seen it run as a city park. I've seen it run as a private foundation. What could we do? Does the neighborhood want to take an ownership and help with this, and help with the development, help with the maintenance? Those are things that we need to take a look at. So I'll be doing a lot of research on that in the next 8 months as well. So.
I think the next thing I was going to talk about was the reuse of those buildings, but I think I've kind of already touched base on that. And then when we wrap this up, if there's certainly questions on any of this topics, we can certainly address those as well.
So, next steps. I hope we were able to articulate what we're going to be doing, the first several months of 2020. We will report our findings back to the Common Council. More likely than not, there's some treatment in the local news media where you can follow it. But if not, I would say sometime perhaps in March, we'll try to have another neighborhood meeting. You'll get a letter from me and we'll invite you to come in and we'll share what we've uncovered. And ultimately, the goal is to get this all packaged up, get the issue in front of the Common Council by the summer, and then the council ultimately will have to decide whether or not it wants to exercise that option. I will say, to read the tea leaves, whatever happens out there for the council to agree to acquire it, I think it needs fairly strong neighborhood support and certainly support from the entire community because the expenditure of money. For my own interest, whether it's this concept or something else, I think we really have to figure out how to structure the purchase so we get that below market value purchase. And to do that, you really need a community use, and my interest is creating a community use that generations of residents of the community can enjoy. That's why I really like this one, because I think this one has legs and will survive a long time as a recreational feature that, as I say, generations might be able to enjoy. So that's what we're going to be doing. We're going to take some questions from you, and as I said, ask them here. And if you don't want to ask in front of folks, you can come up and can talk with us individually. I will say this: I've gotten a bunch of questions. Most of them kind of fit into one of these three categories. And the first is, when might the city purchase the property? If it does, my guess is it would be sometime in August of 2020, near the end of that original 9-month option period. The second set of questions I've gotten all kind of relate to, would the city consider selling any property to the residential property owners? And I would say that can be on the table, although I would say it doesn't work very well if one person wants to buy 20 feet to expand their backyard and the next 6 don't, and the next one does, and you have this jigsaw pattern. I don't think the city would be very interested in that. but the idea if someone wanted to maybe expand their backyard a little bit, you know, I think it could be a topic open for discussion. It's just kind of hard to really make work. And then I get this question a fair amount of time from folks. How is this going to impact our property values? And I'm no expert, I'm not an appraiser, but I would generally say this type of concept, I think, helps stabilize property values. And it does so in a number of ways. Number one, it really prevents other development from encroaching too close to the existing homes. Typically that stabilizes property values, as well as having a well-maintained public use, and I think that's what a conservancy would give us. So again, I'm no expert, but I would think something like this or a similar concept would really help stabilize property values in that neighborhood. So with that, I'm going to invite any of you to just raise your hands. We'll call on you, and I think you in the back had your hand up first.
You mentioned that the property was about two and a quarter, is that right?
225 is our option.
Correct.
Right.
And then you mentioned that the lots in the proposed development would be roughly a quarter of an acre?
I think more likely.
I mean, a third.
Ish.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, based on the layout that you have there, how many lots do you think you would get in that? I mean,
If you could develop up and down Dewey, I would say maybe 20, Bill-ish, give or take.
So if you get 20,
Yes.
I'm assuming that you're going to keep the property values pretty much similar to sort of the inner circle as well. Would that, just the property value, pay for the whole purchase price that you have there? I mean, if you take the 20 lots at roughly
I'm not,
$50,000.
well, I would only say this. I know there's some public improvements that would have to be installed, that gap in sewer, none of that is cheap. I would say this, it would be fair to say that if there is a saleable value, the city would recover some of the money that it used to purchase the property and ultimately to improve it. I don't know how the numbers would shake out.
What's the increase in taxes?
And certainly there's enhanced tax base. There's new tax base from the home. Yep, that would be very true.
Now, would that be just, that tax rate just be imposed on the people in that area or throughout just the way you normally do it?
The entire city tax
Gotcha.
base. Yes, sir.
Who's responsible for the maintenance during this 9-month option? As far as the mowing and,
Madison Golf is still
they're
responsible.
still doing that?
Our obligation is to remove the trees. That's really our sole obligation during this period.
And I have one other question, is that 20-foot barrier that you're talking about on the west side, the far west side, where the drainage area comes back down to Green Street,
Okay.
is that 20 feet from the drainage ditch?
In our concept right now, I believe it's 20 feet to the property line.
Which would be
Which
the
was
drainage ditch?
the drain, you have the drainage ditch within
Oh, within
the
the
property line.
Oh.
It's a,
It's a concept.
Right, there's nothing
It isn't
set in
set in
stone.
stone right now.
When this concept was put together, all we wanted to show is that the Conservancy wasn't going to back up against the individual property owners. So there's a buffer showing there, but as far as in the case that the city does exercise this option and buys this, all of those things will be on the table as far as how the actual stormwater management buffer Conservancy gets designed.
I just wanted to know to figure out if I'm gonna have to take care of the cattails again next year.
Oh.
Next year, again, right now, for the next 9 months, the maintenance is fully on Madison Golf to be able to take care of. So I will be getting calls from you fine people and complaining about the grass, and I guarantee that, and I know that. But because of the fact that we've established a relationship with Madison Gulf, and hopefully we have a little bit drier year next year. I'm hoping that this area gets maintained a little bit better than it has this last year. So, but as far as any maintenance obligations from the city, there's not any additional maintenance that the city is going to be doing within this 9-month period that we currently do, or that we currently don't do.
Right.
Other than trees, yes.
I saw a couple more hands. Ma'am?
What's the main determining factor going to be if the city purchases? Is this only if you can develop the land and sell the lots off? What's the main determination if we go through with this?
I think that's helpful, but I don't think that's the main determiner. I really think, really, the keys are going to be neighborhood and community support. And, do they support an expenditure of dollars? Selling lots just helps us recover some of
Oh,
that
absolutely.
money.
I think you've recovered.
So, and helps with
Property tax
increasing
revenue.
tax revenue and increasing the, the housing stock potentially in the city. So, I really think it's really going to be neighborhood and community support. I think the council knows that the current property owner isn't going to redevelop, isn't going to sell the property, isn't going to do anything, at least in the foreseeable future. And I really think the council would favor seeing some long-term stabilization plan out there with some improvement that can benefit the community. That's how I read those two things. Yes, sir.
I just kind of a question / comment about the assumed wetland area.
Sure.
I mean, I recall 30 years ago when that was a 9-hole golf course.
Yep.
I don't recall any major issues been down in there. Is it because of the development of the area, or is it because of the lack of maintenance over the last several years from Madison Golf? Do we have any idea what might have caused the drainage and the water buildup issues? I mean, I live in the middle of the circle.
Yep.
My mom lives on Fairway Lane.
Yep.
She
So-
burns up a sump pump every year.
So what I can tell you is that, first off, the development of Fairway Circle has contributed somewhat to it. When you look at Fairway Circle, there is no stormwater detention on that development. When that was built, the city, just like every other municipality at that time, did not have stormwater regulations in place. If that were built today, some of those lots would not have been developed because there'd be detention ponds in their place. But I do think there's a strong, one of the big factors is the lack of maintenance. And like I said, 4 years ago, I was able to drive equipment from the corner of Green Street and Fairway Lane back into that development. We had backhoes, we had city trucks back there hauling material out of there, cutting down trees. There's absolutely no way we could even attempt doing that this year. So in the last 4 years, what's changed? Certainly it's not development. So that's one of the things I want to look at to be able to determine, has anything hydraulically changed through there? Is there stormwater features that should be functioning in a different way that have kept water within that area between Fairway Lane and Fairway Circle? And then certainly one of the things, as I've mentioned in previous meetings too, is groundwater. I operate the dam every year, and this time of the year, the dam is normally closed and we have low river levels. Right now, we still have issues with high water. We're up over the banks, or up near the banks, and come spring, we'll be looking at, the potential for early season flooding again. So whether or not that's an anomaly or if that's the new norm, we don't know. So we'll have to look at those things and determine whether or not, tiling that area is a viable option to be able to relieve some of that water in those areas. But, it's called Meadow Springs. We know that it's not, desert land golf or anything like that. So there is water present, and the soils that are present have typical characteristics of high groundwater. So, so to kind of get back to your original question, it's a combination of both that have led to some of those issues.
Anyone else? Yes, sir.
First of all, I liked your comment about saying that this would be a great heritage for the community and be something really worthwhile for the community. I have somewhat of a biased opinion because I live right next to it. But I wonder if you could clarify something else for me, and that is, there's a lot of rumors that the Madison Golf has already claimed bankruptcy on this property. And if that's true, does that affect your ability to buy it at a below market price?
I'm not aware that that has occurred with Madison Gulf. I will say that I think it was January or February, Chris, I think we found out they did put this into a different LLC. I don't remember what that was called. I don't know if that was for
It's in the option.
a tax purpose or whatever it was. So it really is not a Madison Gulf LLC anymore. It's,
LCD, LLC.
so, they did that. But as far as I know, there hasn't been bankruptcy. I don't.
No, I haven't gotten any notice.
That wouldn't affect your ability to...
I don't think so. Quite honestly, I think Madison Gulf, and they own a couple of golf courses, at least the one up in Watertown, they closed. I think they really like to figure this out with the city, quite honestly, and make something work. So, but I don't think it would impact the city's moving forward with it. Anyone else, folks? Yes, sir.
Yeah, just one other recommendation. I love the idea of the conservancy. Totally love the idea of having a legacy for the city going forward. The one thing I would recommend is that when you're looking at the potential impacts, please make sure you're also looking at the potential for wildlife. Because I can tell you, when they stopped maintaining, I mean, I've seen more skunks in our area over the last several years and other things. I mean, I'm not saying it's a bad thing, but, and I love the idea, like I said, I love the idea of the conservancy, but please make sure you're thinking about what kind of effect this could have on wildlife in the community as well.
Well, and Dale, one thing that we are seeing throughout the community is we are seeing more urban wildlife.
Yeah.
I mean, we have in our community garden, we have woodchuck problems. I see them down at Rotary Park, There's woodchucks all over. I mean, walking over by you guys, yep, and I know Island Fells do too. We've talked about that. So that is a problem that isn't just in that area, that's all over. I mean, you're seeing, with the wetlands and the water that we have, we never had a geese problem at Riverfront Park. We have geese, and boy, do we have geese. So we will be looking at that, but yeah,
The
that.
neighborhood mascot right by the existing parking lot is a big old possum. Must have been alive for about 50 years because it's huge.
We may have to look at some of our ordinances.
Anyone else, folks, with a hand? Yes,
I just
Lee?
want to thank all of you for listening to us as community household members
Oh, you're welcome.
with our trees, our water, and the weed issues. You're addressing all of these in a wonderful way. I think this is absolutely outstanding. I support every moment you're moving on this. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. Thanks. Merry Christmas to all of you. Bill, do we have any more maps?